All right, this is episode number 16 of Into the Absurd with Dr. Audrey Fu. She is an assistant professor at the University of Idaho in the Department of Mathematics and Statistical Science. So, what do you teach at the University of Idaho, or what do you do?
So I teach, I do research, and also do some other administrative stuff. So for teaching, I have my background is in statistics. So I teach stat courses. For example, undergrad statistical method course. I also teach graduate stat courses. For example, on statistical computing and theory of regression.
Cool.
Yeah, so my research, so I actually do a lot of research in genomics. So nowadays, there's a lot of data being generated in biology, especially in genomics, with the goal of understanding um, what's really driving all these diseases and see whether we can actually find cures through a better understanding of the genome. So people have generated a lot of data on the genome and also on the all different properties that are derived from the genome. So it's kind of like a data science these days. So that's why a lot of quantitative researchers like statisticians, mathematicians, or and computer scientists are involved in genomic research because there's a lot of data processing and data analysis going on there.
Hmm. And so, you also work a lot with artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so I think artificial intelligence is a pretty broad term. So I think for me, it's more about working on algorithms that I can use to do data analysis. So especially, I think nowadays the maybe it's not I guess it's not the kind of artificial intelligence you see in movies where a robot can think
Yeah.
themselves and then maybe help the human or destroy humans. Not that kind of intelligence, but it's more like at least allow the machine some ability to try to extract information from data because we can look at the data. We can look at data by eye, but we can only look at say maybe tens of data points, and we are not very good at detecting subtle patterns in the data. So that really requires the the intelligence from the machine. So I think artificial intelligence to us is really it's really algorithms. It's really trying to come up with computational ways to better analyze the data.
Because all it really does is takes in as much data as possible, and then given an input, it predicts an output, right?
Yeah, so for example, with this pandemic, we are already seeing a lot of action from statisticians and computer scientists because it involves a lot of so biologists have done sequencing, so they try to piece together the genomes of the COVID virus, and then but then you have to do a data analysis. You have to figure out how the genome from this one patient is the same or different from the genome from this other patient. And then if you have tens of, or if you very often we now have thousands of genomes from COVID patients, and then the question is, how do I look at these thousands of genomes? How do I detect differences? And are the differences we see in this part of the genome important, or are actually the differences from another part more important? So that's computational, that's data analysis, and also uh, guided by biological principles. So, so actually, that's so this genome is what I want to focus on today. So I'm sure Greg, you
Yeah.
also heard about the several variants we've been talking about of the COVID virus.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know what do you know about those variants?
With COVID.
Yeah.
Um, well, I know that it's definitely disproportionately affecting my minority groups, and there's also two strains in it. So, with that being said, we mainly have data from the first strain, and we're using that on the second strain, as I understand it. I don't know.
Yeah. So there are definitely a lot of issues with the COVID research. So for the different strains, so that's really because every living organism is always evolving, which means that there are always mutations happening all the time. So that's the same as the COVID virus. So that's why we have those different strains. They're still in this big family of the COVID virus, but at the same time, one strain has probably some differences in their genome from the genome of this other strain. But compared to the entire genome, so maybe 90% of the genome is still identical across these different strains. But once in a while, on the genome of this new strain, then some positions are different from the other strains, and some of those positions can really cause problems. Maybe they can make the virus more contagious somehow. So that's why we care about these mutations, basically these different. So they're actually called variants, genetic variants along the genome. So the way we're looking at this pandemic is kind of like um, watching evolution within just a few months. Whereas at the same time, if we think about humans, um, essentially the same process happened over tens of thousands of years. So, so it means that now if you look at one person versus another person, you will also see differences in their genomes. So in fact, nowadays we already know that so roughly maybe every 1,000 positions on the genome, we will have this. We tend to have one variant. So that variant means that this position is not the same in all the individuals in human populations. This variant sometimes takes the form of A in say Europeans, and then it takes the form of say T maybe in Africans. So there are differences, and those differences can be different in people of different ethnicities. So so the human genome is much longer than a virus genome. So the human genome is a little over 3 billion bases, so 3 billion positions basically. Um, so just to put that into context, so nowadays, the around the entire world, there's close to maybe 8 billion people. So a little less than 8 billion people in the whole world, and the human genome, just from any person, that human genome is a little over 3 billion bases, 3 billion positions. So it's kind of like taking maybe less than half of the people around the world and then line them up. So there you essentially get our genome. And then every
Wow.
1,000 people, then you get that variant being different in different individuals.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the scale we're working with. So that means if every 1,000 positions we get a genetic variant, then along the entire human genome, we would have roughly 4 million differences per million genetic variants. So that that can be a lot. So that's why nowadays the research is really um, being done, trying to figure out exactly which of them really matter for, say, cancer, which of them matter for Alzheimer's, and so on. So that kind of research is called genome-wide association studies. They're essentially trying to identify which of those genetic variants, which of those positions along the human genome may be causal to some diseases. Yeah, so that's the I think that's the main area in genomic research these days. But then it connects back to that inequality issue you mentioned earlier. So with COVID, we saw that the so the rate of being infected and also the mortality rate is higher in minorities and people of color. So actually, I took a look at the statistics on the CDC website. So
Yeah.
yeah, so as of current, so this is the numbers are based on the numbers are good through the end of January. So based on the statistics up to then, the so people of the uh, so American Indians or other Native Americans, they have their mortality rate is actually 2.4 times that of the white, and the
Wow.
yeah, so that is really high. And then Black or African Americans, their mortality rate is 1.9 times that of the white, and then Hispanics, their mortality rate is 2.3 times the mortality rate. So yeah, that's quite stunning. And unfortunately, that's also true for other disease research. So going back to that genome-wide association studies I mentioned earlier, so nowadays there are a lot of studies have been done. But again, unfortunately, so far, again, this data is also has been updated just recently in February. Over 88% of the individuals included in those studies are of European descent, and then the next ethnic group is Asian, but that counts only a little over 6%, and then for Africans or African Americans combined, that's less than 2%, and for Hispanics or Latin Americans, that's less than 1%. So, so again, so that really points to a huge problem with genomic research or medical research in general, which is a lot of focus has been on people of European descent, and we have gained a lot of insight from looking at these individuals. So that's definitely very helpful. So we definitely have a much better understanding of how some cancers work or some other diseases work. We definitely have gained insights into the mechanisms. But at the same time, we also know that the conclusions don't always carry over to people of other ethnicities. So, um, so very often, um, the very often the mutations that are considered to be causing, say, some cancer, they may be common among people of European descent, but they are not necessarily common in other ethnicities. So just because we are able to identify those variants based on the current association studies doesn't mean that's also true. That's not, or the conclusion is meaningful for, say, Africans, or Asians. So, so that's why nowadays I think, for example, NIH, the National Institutes of Health, they're trying to expand research of this type to try to include as many other ethnicities as possible, so that we are we are we don't miss this research insights for other for people of other researchers. Um, so there has been progress. So, for example, we can actually see that in this cancer consortium. So there is a huge cancer consortium in the U.S. which is called TCGA, the Cancer Genome Atlas project. So in this project, the researchers have collected patients uh, from different ethnic groups. Roughly, the proportions are roughly comparable to the proportions in the American population. So you do have still the majority being European people of the European descent, but you also have a good proportion of people with the African descent. Unfortunately, with this research, with this project, the total number of patients being included is still low. So far, only a couple of thousands are included for each cancer. So they actually included patients of around 40 cancer types, and then for each cancer type, usually is only around a couple thousand patients. So even though the proportion of say African Americans in this study is say comparable to the general population, which is roughly 13 to 15%. But at the same time, if you actually look at the absolute number of African American patients included in the study, it's only about 50 patients for that cancer type. And that's 50 is still a very tiny
Mhm.
number for us to really do rigorous statistical analysis. So that just means that,
That's
well,
barely anything.
yeah, exactly. So that just means we are making progress, but at the same time, it's still not enough. So just because we see the proportions in that cancer study more or less matching the proportions in the natural in the American population, doesn't really mean that we are ready to do the kind of research we did before for people of the European descent. So there's definitely still a long way to go in the genomic research. So,
Yeah. And what? Sorry.
oh, I just wonder whether you have comments or questions.
Oh yeah, no, I was just about to say that everyone's bodies are different, and we can't base because I mean if because like obviously there's a little bit of genetic variance between white people and black people and um, Hispanic and Asians, so we can't really base everyone's body on the same data because it would disproportionately affect the way that we take care of their body.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So that's why a very hot research trend in genomic research is called precision medicine. So the goal is really to be able to get the sequence of each person, trying to know the genetic variants in that person, and see whether there could be drugs designed for those mutations, or at least treatments specific to that kind of genetic variants in people. But at the same time, the challenge is still that um, there's so much unknowns in the genomes of people of color or people of other ethnic groups. So, for example, I don't know whether you've done DNA sequencing, but for example, the 23andMe Ancestry test.
Yeah, I have not.
Okay, yeah. So, what's interesting with that test is that I think it's it can really tell you what kind of ancestry your DNA might be similar to, especially for people of European descent. So one of my students actually did that test before, so he got a very colorful results back. So his ancestry really traced back to a lot of different places in Europe and also a little bit Native American here in
Hmm.
the US. So it was very interesting. But at the same time, being Chinese myself, I know that this test is not going to be very interesting for me per se, because I know that test, in order to really know your ancestry, you have to have a database you can compare with. So it means that in
Hmm.
order to really know whether your DNA has ancestry from Germany or from Italy and so on, you need DNA data from those two countries. So far, that database, again, it also contains mostly people from Europe, of European descent.
Hmm.
So the resolution for people of European descent is very high. So we actually have maybe data from northern Italy or southern Italy and so on, or at least all the countries in Europe. But outside that, the data actually is quite sparse. So I think if I do a
Wow.
test, the best I could know is that I'm probably 90% Chinese, and maybe with some similarity to people of the Korean ancestry, of Mongolian ancestry, or maybe Vietnamese ancestry, but that's all. So it's not going to give me a detailed picture as detailed as the one for people of European descent. I think it's basically because the reference database just doesn't really have that kind of resolution for people outside the European ancestry. So that again is a that's I think that's really just I think that's a very common phenomenon. So even though nowadays there are also a lot of Asian countries doing sequencing, still either is because their databases are not really uh, well connected to the databases in the US. So here
Hmm.
we don't really have access to those databases, or many countries don't even have the resources to do this kind of sequencing, especially in poor countries. For example, not just the poor countries in Asia, but also poor countries in Africa. So in many countries, they just cannot afford this kind of sequencing effort. So nowadays, NIH and maybe also the funding agencies in Europe, they know the importance of having the African genomes so that we can really get a better understanding of which genetic variants are really associated with disease. But at the same time, they know that they really need to do this sequencing uh, project in Africa. So what's
Hmm.
going on now is that sequencing is beginning to be done in Africa, but most of the research efforts are still being led by researchers in Europe or in the US. And then the goals don't necessarily align, because for Africans, it's important for them to actually know which variants could be meaningful for diagnosis and for developing drugs. But those are not necessarily the same as the goals of the European or African or American investigators. So for European for, for American investigators, maybe the goal is really to uh, get the genomes and see how that's going to benefit people in the U.S. or Europe. And those African genomes are very likely used as some reference genomes. But the goal probably is not going to be improving the health of Africans from Africa.
Hmm.
So that's why this disparity in sequencing effort and in disease research is still a huge problem, not only within developed countries but really across the whole world. Is probably even it's even worse. So I think poorer countries really just they're lagging behind this new type of biology, so they don't necessarily have the equipment to do sequencing. They also don't necessarily have the technical expertise to analyze the sequence data. And without this knowledge, without this technology, then they just really at a disadvantaged place of managing the health of, of their own, which can have um, which can have an impact on people in the developed country. Because
Hmm.
just look at the pandemic. Um,
Yeah.
the pandemic nowadays is taking place, I would say, more and more often, probably as a result of climate change, so that the habitat of the wildlife is reduced greatly, and then that forces interaction between humans and wildlife animals. And then once this barrier is broken down more and more, then it's more likely for us, for humans, to be infected by viruses that first infected the wildlife animals. So that's why it's not just the COVID virus. There's also Zika. There's also Ebola. There are just and there are still more other possible viruses that
Mhm.
we don't know yet, or we're not ready for yet. So I think the poor healthcare conditions in poorer nations can eventually come back to people in the developed countries, because viruses don't really care about where you live or what kind of ethnicity you are of. They
Yeah.
once it becomes an epidemic, it's just going to keep spreading, and then the current climate will just make the spreading of a disease much easier these days. So that's why I think not only we need to manage the disparity in the U.S. itself, but also it's not only of this moral responsibility, but also of practical importance to also
Mhm.
improve the health condition in pretty much the entire world, not just the developed countries themselves.
Yeah, and if we try to protect others, it'll in turn protect us.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's kind of something that people should just do on a personal basis too.
What do you mean?
Well, when you're good to other people, usually they'll be good to you too. Or if you protect other people, you'll be protected as well. Just in general, not even as a disease thing, but as a karmatic sort of, you know, what goes around comes around. I mean, whether or not that's a real thing or not, uh, I think it's definitely a good idea to keep in mind as far as when we encounter these diseases or these pandemics or any of these problems. But
Uh huh. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So, um, I mean, nowadays there are still people that are, or I should say, minority groups that it's not. I think it's unfair to say that they don't understand genomics or the importance of genetic sequencing, but they feel insecure. So especially with indigenous
Mhm.
groups around the whole world, this has been a problem. So I think as a researcher, I often read papers in the Nature magazine or the Science magazine, and sometimes you would see papers like we discovered this we discovered this ancient DNA from here and there, and or we discovered this very interesting piece of DNA from this group of people in this remote area. That's because, again, usually the efforts are led by European or American investigators. So they go into these tribes, and then some of them do a pretty good job communicating the, the necessity of this research with the local people, indigenous tribes, and then they gain their trust, and then they gain their collaboration. But very often, what comes out of this research effort? Usually, it just results in uh, some big impact paper that you can read about this paper in news coverage. You can the authors can uh, can get fame from publishing this kind of big impact papers. But what benefit does it bring to the indigenous tribes? There's very little. So I think the
Hmm.
return of collaborating with researchers of on these projects has been very marginal for indigenous people. And meanwhile, because of their own culture and traditions, some of them don't really consider getting their blood taken or getting their genome sequenced by outsiders something even meaningful to them, something even sensible to them, which is completely understandable because not only these are a bunch of outsiders coming here to draw their blood, but also they don't really bring anything back. So what's the point for them
Hmm.
to form this kind of collaboration? So that's why I can completely understand why some indigenous people have this mistrust or maybe even fear of sequencing sequencing research. So for that reason, so I think this is just in the past few years. For example, a tribe in the U.S., uh, Navajo Nation, they even put kind of a temporary ban on doing sequencing research because they just don't see the
Wow.
benefit. They don't see why this is even relevant to them. So I think there's also this disparity is also shown in this kind of understanding or this knowledge gap where we already know how important it is to have the sequences, to have the genomes, to know the mutations. But for them, this hasn't really brought very much benefit. So it's hard to convince people when you don't show them benefits that directly matter to them. So
Hmm.
that's still an issue, not only in the U.S. but also it's really across the whole world. Um, so that's also that's another side of this disparity in disease or genomic research.
Yeah, and I think it's with all of this disparities, it's really going to cause, or it already is causing, a huge breakdown um, of the medical community. At least it's not. I mean, if we're negatively, if all this research isn't actually helping anyone except for white people, then it's not really doing any good since there's way more people than just white people.
Yeah, it definitely brings some insights. It definitely helps us improve or advance the biology itself as a field, and definitely, I mean, benefiting some people is still benefiting the world. But at the same time, I think there's still
Yeah.
a long way to go to bring this benefits to
Hmm.
more people, um, especially to people that are in poorer nations or that don't necessarily have the knowledge or technique to have a better understanding of this kind of research. So that really is has already caused problems. So, for example, cancers cancers are a big problem in developing countries. They are also big problems in developing countries too. So I was just looking at some statistics on cancers across the whole world the other day. So what I noticed is that, well, this is actually no, so but I confirmed the statistics the other day. So the disparity is also in between men and women. So, for example, in if we're talking about cancers that are more prevalent in female, that would be breast cancer and cervical cancer. So these two cancers together across the whole world, um, the rate of these two cancers together is roughly 60 per 1,000 per 100,000 individuals. And then if we compare this to prostate cancer, it's about 30 per 100,000 individuals. So that means for women, the risk of having breast cancer or cervical cancer is twice of men developing prostate cancer across the whole world.
Wow.
So that's another kind of disparity. And then this is not just the cancer rate, but also there's even a bigger gap in the death rate in cancers. So again, if we look at breast cancer and cervical cancer together, the death rate is nearly 3 times of the death rate for prostate cancer. So that just shows that the disparity is not only just between the wealthier countries and the poorer nations, but also between men and women. And that's still an issue everywhere because
Mm-hmm.
um, so I mentioned this article from The Guardian that came out two years ago, looking at this inequality in designs for men and women. So that's a, that's just a different way of looking at how um, what this disparity can exhibit in our society, not only in terms of the uh, cancer deaths, but also in other aspects in society as well. So there, in addition to this gap in between cancer treatments, there are several other issues. So, for example, um, car crashes. So even though the developed countries have done a really good job doing the dummy test to ensure that the car is designed safely for drivers and passengers. But unfortunately, the dummies that are used in these tests uh, have been the, the using the body shape of a young white man. So that has been used as the standard dummy for all these crash tests. So only in the I think in the past maybe 20 years, uh, the there has been requirements that you have to add a female dummy, not just scale down the male dummy so that that's the female dummy. No,
Yeah.
you have to redesign the anatomy so that that dummy is really representing the female body. But unfortunately, the
Mm-hmm.
female dummy that has been used so far is still only the 5 percentile for the female bodies. So unlike
Mm-hmm.
the male dummy, which is considered roughly in the middle of the distribution of the male anatomy, the the existing female dummy is really just for 5% of the women. So you can imagine. So for
Wow.
myself, I'm short. So every time I drive, I have a hard time. I need to adjust the seat, and I also every time
Mm-hmm.
I pull the seat belt, I can really feel that the seat belt is cutting into my neck. So so it's not a very comfortable experience, and that's that's not just with the seat belt, also with all sorts of seats in the public in general. But for the seat belt, it means that uh, I can really feel this difference. I can really feel that the seatbelt is not designed for women. It's not designed for the majority of women. And in fact, it's even worse for pregnant women. So that article from the Guardian mentioned that so far there is still no requirement for using a pregnant dummies in these crash tests, whereas the seatbelt we typically use doesn't necessarily fit a pregnant woman's body. So,
Wow.
so you can just imagine that how uncomfortable it would be for a pregnant woman to drive or to be in a car. And in fact, even nowadays, car crashes are still the leading cause of pregnant women, surprisingly. And very
Hmm.
likely, the just this illy designed car for pregnant women could be responsible. So that's my guess. I think that's just by looking at how not right now we don't even have this requirement for having a pregnant dummy for crash test. I think that alone can really be number one number one reason for why this is what we're seeing now.
No, I think that could definitely be a huge reason. Especially, I mean, I know some cars are at least having the seatbelt adjustable, the height of it, and the car seat a little bit more adjustable, but um, there's still a long ways to go before it works for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. So I think before we also talked a little bit about maybe the training data for artificial intelligence. So in artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
when developing algorithms, we often we usually would need a lot of training data in order to guide artificial intelligence to know what patterns there are and how to use those patterns. So, so this Guardian article also mentioned this other type of, or the one of the applications of this kind of training data, which is speech recognition. So
Mm.
this I also have some personal experience because sometimes
Yeah.
when I talk to my Google speaker over there, sometimes it just doesn't really recognize me. So I learned this trick that I need to lower my voice for it to better recognize me. So again,
Oh, wow.
that's because very often the speech recognition software is trained on male voice, but not enough
Hmm.
female voice data. So the speech recognition software tools they can recognize better male voice that's generally lower than recognizing female voices. So in this Guardian
Hmm.
article, it talks about this very interesting story that the author was going on a ride with her mom, and then for some reason their car couldn't really respond to their voice commands. So her mom tried several times, just couldn't figure out why. Uh, and so this author suggested that she talk in a lower voice so that
Wow.
the system could recognize her. Meanwhile, uh, I don't remember the detail, but her dad was also in the car. So even though her dad was not driving, her dad was just talking normally. The system would respond because of the lower voice. So
Wow.
yeah, so it sounds like a funny story, sounds like a joke we can talk about, but really it can become it can become lethal in dangerous situations, right? So for
Yeah, I mean, it sucks.
yeah, so if you're stuck in a car crash and you couldn't move, you can only talk to your car, and your car doesn't recognize you. That would
Yeah.
be a total disaster.
Hmm. Yeah, I could just imagine the people that are making the algorithms, like these voice detection algorithms, and then they make it and like, wait, we only use men. Like, what are we thinking?
Yeah, I think I'm sure they don't just use the voice samples from men, but I think it means
Yeah, but
not enough training data from
mhm.
female. There's not enough. I think the algorithm is not tailored well enough to female voices, so they need
Yeah.
they probably need a much larger database for a much more balanced database of voice samples.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so
Cool.
I think those are kind of uh, funny stories we sometimes tell and we sometimes read about, but very often it just when so many funny stories happen, then you realize just how inconvenient it is to be,
Mm-hmm.
well, for example, to be a woman in this society. Um, so
Yeah.
that article also talks about other things. So, for example, maybe more on the more serious side. So, the bulletproof vests, again, they're designed for not very suitable for female body. So, this article talks about. So this is a British newspaper. So this article talks about female officers from the UK when they have to wear those body armors, they have to adjust somehow because the the vest just doesn't really fit the female body very well. And in fact, one of the female officers said that she had to do a breast reduction so that she could wear
Wow.
the body armor. And then this other female officer, she actually ended up dying because when she was trying to wear the body armor and also um, try to use some sort of ram to open the door in one of the operations. She couldn't do both, so she had to take off her body armor in order to use that
Wow.
ram, and then she ended up getting killed. So that again was solely because the body armor was just not designed to account for the anatomy of a female body. And then there are other stories like, well, the reason why we always fight in the office about the thermostat, about the temperatures we set. That's because again, females tend to have a lower metabolic rate than males, even when
Yeah.
performing the same kind of task. So I think that article mentions that there's probably a difference of 5 degrees. That's probably 5 degrees Celsius. This is a British newspaper. So that means it's a huge gap. So for the typical temperatures set at the office in the office environment, it means that very often it's too cold for most women. At least that's how I feel. So every time if I go to a place with AC, I would always remember to bring a jacket or a sweater just so that I can
Yeah.
stay warm. So in that room, you can see that I'm wearing the outfit probably from entirely different season from a lot of people in that room. Many men are in shorts, and I'm there with my winter jacket or a sweater on.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of well. I mean, it's not just in the workplace. I mean, if you go, because I just remember growing up with my mom, and we go to a movie theater, a restaurant, a supermarket, and she's always got to wear a sweatshirt inside because she says, "Oh, well, it's going to be too cold in there." And then, like, really, it's so warm in there. I don't know. And I didn't realize that the until middle school when we were learning about the different body temperatures that the female body temperature is about 1 to 2 degrees lower than the male. Is that correct?
I actually didn't know about that.
Yeah, the average body temperature is just slightly lower than the male body temperature. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's has something to do with body size. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's definitely. I mean, we can't base a society on 50% of the population.
Yeah, it's not just 50. The I think the standard, because the standards were first developed in European countries, so it's actually the average white male. So so
Yeah,
you can imagine there's a lot of uh, also a lot of Asian men and African men. They don't necessarily have the same height as as white men. So actually,
Yeah.
they have similar experience too. So for example, when we come back to the seat belt design or
Hmm.
just design of the seats in general, then again for them it's also uncomfortable design
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Mm.
So I think there's really a lot of inconveniences that we may not even be aware of
Yeah.
if we don't go out there and listen to other people and just put us in their shoes to see how they live their life day to day. I think very often it's hard to know. It's difficult to know that the world is very different for other
Yeah, I think over time a lot of people are starting to realize that there's a lot of differences out there, and that hopefully we can solve all these problems as we move forward. But I think there's still a
people.
long way to go.
Yeah.
But well, it was awesome having you on the podcast, and I really appreciated learning all the things that you just taught me. So
It has been nice talking to you, Greg. I didn't really want to come to this show and just give a lecture, and hope I didn't give a lecture. I really hope it was productive conversation.
no, it did not feel like a lecture at all. It felt very informative. So it was not a lecture. So don't worry about that.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad you're doing this. I think I really like that people trying to understand understand other world, other people's lives, and
Hmm.
also trying to speak up. I think that's nice. I really, um, yeah, maybe this is a whole other topic. I think nowadays, especially with the past few years, I think some people somehow manage to just build a wall in their mind, thinking that
Hmm.
whatever in their mind is how the world works, and that's so not true. I think
Yeah.
even if when even if when we open our eyes, even if when we're presented all the information, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily seeing them or we're necessarily even understanding them. Just because I'm talking about this disparity in research between the wealthier nations and the poorer nations doesn't necessarily mean I really understand how much suffering the people in the poorer nations are really having due to this lack of proper healthcare.
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's more theoretical, um, but at the same time, I think that's why we always need to remind ourselves that there just is definitely not we cannot just build that wall in our mind to think that okay, as long as I'm good, then this world is good. That's so not the case.
Yeah. I think it's important for people to, take a figurative sledgehammer and just destroy that wall and walk out.
Yeah.
But
It can be a tough
so awesome. Well, yeah, no, it can be really hard to do that. It's just for everyone, especially just how the the human brain is built to have all these implicit biases and have all these and to build walls around things, and categorize things. And it's really hard to break through all those categorizations and all those walls. Um, I don't know. But so for all you out there that have any questions, comments, or concerns, just email into.the.absurd.podcast@gmail.com. Awesome. Thank you for listening.